It was the reason why many preteen boys stayed up after hours. It contributed to the early 2000s pop culture obsession with spring break, and it empowered one of the wildest unchecked people to do some really bad things and get away with them for the most part. Of course, I'm talking about Girls Gone Wild and the morally corrupt Joe Francis. Truly a pernicious, pernicious man. His behavior was pernicious. But what's the true story behind the topless drunk chicks on those DVD covers? And how does Joe Francis fit within the cultural zeitgeist? This man has deep connections to some of the most powerful people in Hollywood, despite a very public and negative track record. And those kind of connections always fascinate me. So we're gonna get into it today. The story of Girls Gone Wild, Joe Francis, and how he's linked to people like Kim Kardashian, Lance Bass, and fucking Al Sharpton. I can't even believe I just said those three people in the same sentence. But you know what? It's real. I did watch the 2 hit pieces about him on Peacock and Max, and I felt like they were really good and told individual stories really well, but there was a lot that they left out or skimmed over. Obviously, in any piece of content, this is gonna happen, but I was just really curious about the details and nuance that they left out, so I decided to dive into all of the controversies myself. We're gonna talk about everything that the documentaries didn't really touch on. Also, I'm working with a bit of a new setup here. We got a new couch and I don't have a chaise to sit on, so I'm like, what should I do? I don't know what I'm doing. This might change. I'm just trying stuff out. Please bear with me. As per usual, all of my references are linked in the description if you want to go down any specific rabbit holes, because trust me, there are a lot. But for now, we're just gonna start at the beginning. If you remember the days of clip shows like America's Funniest Home Videos, you probably remember Real TV. The show ran in the late 90s and they would just share crazy footage of gas station robberies, protesters flipping over cars, bears running into campsites. The idea was that these were the clips that news stations received from stringers but didn't use. Fresh USC graduate Joe Francis befriended a bigwig at Paramount, the company behind Real TV, and got hooked up with a $350 a week PA role. And he's chugging along at the bottom of the entertainment industry food chain when he discovers that there's a lot of footage Real TV isn't using. Some of the submissions were too violent or controversial for television, so Real TV producers just let him go. But Joe saw these submissions as a missed opportunity. Well, according to a 2000 lawsuit, a Real TV producer saw these as missed opportunities and Joe just stole his idea. Regardless, Joe asked the head honchos at Real TV if he could license this crazy unused footage for his own project, and they said, sure, you're not gonna be able to put it on TV yourself, so there's no value here anyway, whatever. And they were right. You can't show someone getting hit by a train or an elephant going on a rampage on television, but you could show those things on tape. Joe started combing through the footage and, with the help of Billy Crystal's brother randomly, released a tape called Banned from Television in 1998. 2.5 hours of debauchery, violence, and gore. He ran infomercials to get the word out, and the tape started selling like crazy. IMDb puts the sales at $10 million. By the age of 24, Joe Francis was a millionaire. He released a few more tapes, and one day, as he's combing through some footage to license, he comes across a clip of some girls in New Orleans for Mardi Gras shaking their tits for some beads. Of course, this is a man in his mid-20s, and he's totally enthralled by this, so he calls up the guy who filmed it to ask how much of this party girl footage he's got. And the guy tells him, I don't know, I got hours and hours of this. I just filmed this stuff for fun. Fucking jackpot. Joe drove all over Southern California, going from video store to video store in search of content like this, but no one else was compiling videos of normal, real girls doing X-rated stuff. He decided to license that random guy's footage and release it himself. But he wasn't gonna lump it in with the crazy banned from television clips. This was gonna be its own separate entity called College Women. No wait, that's dumb. Girls Gone Crazy? College Girls Gone Wild. Well, what if they weren't all in college? It had to be just Girls Gone Wild. There was just one little problem. Banned from Television could barely get a commercial on TV due to the censors. I mean, they had to cover up most of the screen for almost the entire thing. How was Joe supposed to sell Girls Gone Wild? It wasn't like he could just partner with OF models or run ads on porn sites. In the late 90s, it was television advertising or bust. Most shows refused to allow Girls Gone Wild ads to run during their programming, but really, he only needed one. And at the time, there was one show that was crazy enough to make sense: Howard Stern. Howard had a nightly show on E! At the time, and they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff on there. Plus, his audience and the Girls Gone Wild buyer were one and the same: horny dudes. As soon as those ads started running on Howard Stern, Girls Gone Wild was well on its way to becoming an empire. Eventually, the infomercials became more commonplace, and the tapes were flying off the shelves. I'm sure you remember falling asleep with the TV on as a kid and then waking up at 3 a.m. to see college girls flashing the camera with that big censored bar over them, that damn calypso music in the back. I mean, the ads were everywhere. This was the thing about Girls Gone Wild. It was different from other dirty videos, kind of similar to how Playboy had started back in the day. The idea was that these were innocent innocent, sweet, young, usually white, girls next door. You'd never think that they'd ever flash you or make out with their friends or whatever. But on Girls Gone Wild, they were on vacation, spring break. They were drinking, their guard was down, and it was the perfect situation to turn sweet little Janie, the cheerleader and neighbor girl, into an ultra-sexualized being. That was the whole shtick. Sweet college girls partying and being crazy. And the world ate it up. In its first couple of years, Girls Gone Wild made over $20 million, and its infomercials were airing on every major TV network. It got to the point where Joe was unable to license enough footage to keep up with the demand. Plus, he'd run into legal trouble because many of the stringers didn't actually get the girls they shot to sign releases. These girls would agree to let a random guy film them, maybe, but then their image would wind up on billboards, TV, and on a best-selling tape that they'd never agreed to be on. One of the earliest lawsuits came from a woman who had been filmed by one of these randoms while on vacation in Lake Havasu. She flashed the crowd without realizing that someone was filming, and then wound up on the DVD cover, website, ad pop-ups, and TV commercials. Joe settled out of court, but he'd had enough of these random cameramen sending him footage that wasn't above board. He was gonna have to take to the streets and oversee everything himself. He and his crew started touring the US in a series of tour buses wrapped in the notorious Girls Gone Wild logos. Turns out that Joe was really good at convincing drunk girls to get naked for him. He and his camera crew of hot guys perfected the art of, well, some would say persuasion, others would call it coercion. Either way, he was getting the footage he needed. All he had to do was offer them a Girls Gone Wild branded trucker hat or t-shirt and they'd flash. If he ever did pay, he was throwing these girls a $100 bill or less and calling it a day. After all, this was the rich, famous, and conventionally attractive Joe Francis calling you hot and begging for you. And let's be clear here, Joe and his crew weren't just going after any girl in the club. You had to be chosen, and many women weren't because they didn't fit the Girls Gone Wild ideal. So there was definitely an element of feeling picked as well. But that doesn't mean that the girls who went wild did so without regrets. I mean, who among us has not woken up the morning after a drunken night out and thought, what the hell did I do last night? The official Girls Gone Wild policy was that anyone featured in the videos could request a removal within 90 days, and they would honor that, unless the woman was super hot and good for sales. Then she'd be shit out of luck. Also, if the woman specifically annoyed Joe, he'd put her on the cover. But that's just another Tuesday for an Aries man. Joe faced a lot of lawsuits, most of which he was able to easily settle out of court with pretty low payouts. I mean, what's throwing $10,000 at a problem when you're making millions? And what's more, sometimes the settlement allowed Girls Gone Wild to continue distributing and profiting off of their image. Lake Havasu girl from earlier, I can still easily find her on the DVD cover with a simple Google search. And she sued and settled. The biggest issue for the girls was that the Girls Gone Wild crew covered their asses with video releases and ID checks. And the girls would usually show, review, and sign on camera. So now you have this video of someone who is presumably an adult excitedly signing the release to be on tape. How can you really fight Girls Gone Wild when they have that on you? Despite the lawsuits and behind-the-scenes backlash, Girls Gone Wild was a behemoth of a company throughout the early 2000s, and Joe Francis seemed untouchable. They cut a deal with Snoop Dogg to do Girls Gone Wild Doggy Style, a bestseller. They went on tour with Eminem, showcasing his wild fans, although that tape was never released. Joe said it was because Eminem looked too short next to him, but who really knows what happened there? They'd partner with clubs and bars, advertising their presence on the radio, and excited girls would show up in droves. The ultimate goal of the night was to get some fun party scenes in the club and then bring women back on the bus. Sure, you can flash and do a little something on the dance floor, but on the tour bus, it was a quiet, controlled environment. On the tour bus, they could get away with filming a lot more than just a pair of titties, you know what I mean? What I didn't realize when I saw those commercials as a kid was that Girls Gone Wild tapes were centered around these bus and hotel room scenes. And let's just say they were doing a lot more than going topless. The back rooms on the buses had cabinets full of objects for girls to use on themselves and their friends as a cameraman stood between them and the door. The Girls Gone Wild crew was literally trained to get the footage they needed by any means necessary. Be aggressive, don't let up. Get it done. And they did, even though the on-camera talent was often really uncomfortable. I mean, these weren't professional porn stars. These were usually 18 and 19-year-old girls being instructed by some random guy that the company had hired off of Craigslist. Even just thinking about that, that's weird. And even though many girls tried and failed to bring down Joe Francis in those early days, a case in the Redneck Riviera started to look like it just might work. Yes, I said the Redneck Riviera, because that's what people called the Alabama-Florida coast at the time. It was a go-to tourist destination for decades because of its white white sand beaches, and close proximity to major cities like Atlanta, Nashville, and New Orleans. Think 30A, Panama City Beach, Destin, that kind of area of northern Florida. In the 2000s, Panama City Beach was a hot vacation spot on MTV's Spring Break, and this made it the perfect shoot location for Girls Gone Wild. The crew went down there a few times, renting out hotel rooms, throwing alcohol-fueled ragers, and getting the money shots. Clearly, it was a total win, and the pay-per-views popped off. This former Girls Gone Wild cameraman described a situation in which their party was broken up by police mid-shoot. The on-camera talent ran out of there and told the officer that they'd fed her drinks and filmed her doing X-rated things, and his response was, "Can I get a copy of that?" Like I said, untouchable. But eventually, the locals got real tired of the partying and obscenity. In 2003, the police started coming for Joe and Girls Gone Wild, attempting to shut down production for lewd behavior, and Joe responded by suing them. Girls Gone Wild was a work of art, documentary if you will, and the Panama City Beach police were infringing upon his First Amendment rights with their shenanigans. After being served on camera, they settled with Joe, but this whole situation put him on their shit list. They were determined to nail him, and they got their wish when a concerned dad walked into the sheriff's office one morning with a complaint. The previous night, his daughter and 3 friends had gone back to the Girls Gone Wild hotel suite. 2 of them filmed a shower scene with a cameraman in exchange for $100 each. The other 2 went into a back bedroom with Joe. Not only did the 2 friends majorly regret the shower scene, the girls who hung back with Joe were alleging that he'd forced them to give him a in exchange for $50. Oh, and 3 of them were 17 years old. The 4th was 16. Even though they'd all signed waivers, none of them legally held up because they were minors. Panama City Beach officials had been handed that annoying little weasel Joe Francis on a silver platter, and they were excited to finally get his ass. Honestly, a little too excited. They raided the condo that Joe was renting in town, took his private jet and Ferrari, and arrested him and several crew members. During the raids, they found drugs and a bunch of footage featuring at least 30 underage girls. And these investigators charged Joe with everything they possibly could. I mean, the indictment had over 70 charges, ranging from disorderly conduct to child to racketeering. They RICO'd his ass. He and the crew bailed out of jail the next day, and Joe returned to California while he awaited trial. After all, he had a business to run. And ever the guy to turn lemons into lemonade, Joe compiled all of this confiscated footage into a new best-selling tape, Girls Gone Wild, the seized video. Seriously. To put it plainly, no one really gave a fuck about Joe's Florida charges. The girls had signed releases and lied about their ages, even going so far as, according to Joe, presenting fake IDs. So as far as Hollywood was concerned, whatever went down was on them. I mentioned earlier that Girls Gone Wild had made Joe Francis a celebrity in his own right, and that was real. According to Joe, whoever controlled the controlled Hollywood, and he was that guy. Everyone wanted to be around him. He signed a multi-million-dollar deal to distribute home videos for Playboy, with his crew filming those iconic Playboy mansion parties and casting calls. He also claims to have slept with 2 out of the 3 girls next door, although he won't say who. A gentleman. As Girls Gone Wild pulled in tens of millions a year, Joe rubbed shoulders with celebrities like Brad Pitt, who was a huge fan of the tapes and paid for a monthly subscription. He was best friends with TV personality Mario Lopez, and dated some of Hollywood's hottest socialites like Paris Hilton, Tara Reid, and Kimberly Stuart. Side note, I listened to a podcast interview he did, and he fucking hates Paris Hilton. He talks so much shit about her, and Kathy. He did say that Kyle Richards was cool though. Anyway, he was neighbors in Bel Air with Elon Musk and legendary music producer Quincy Jones. He even claims to have bought the first Tesla ever made. And on top of all of that, he'd also spent 2 years building a 45,000 square foot compound in Mexico. Celebrities like Jennifer Aniston, Eva Longoria, and Lindsay Lohan frequently visited. Joe Francis really had it all: money, fame, and power. And while his flashy lifestyle attracted a lot of good attention, it brought about some dark situations too. In early 2004, Joe returned to his Bel Air mansion after a night of partying to find a man with a gun. The man forced him to undress and filmed a video of him with a implying that he was about to use it on himself. He made Joe say on camera that he was from Boys Gone Wild and liked it up the ass. The plan was to extort him. If Joe was willing to pay up to the tune of $300,000, this man would destroy the tape. If not, he'd just release it and embarrass the fuck out of one of Hollywood's biggest playboys. In addition to the tape, the man stole Joe's Picasso paintings, designer luggage, cash, and even his cell phone, among other valuables. He forced a zip-tied Joe into his own Bentley in the garage and drove him down the street before ditching him there. It was a terrifying experience for sure, but Joe was not down to pay this random guy. Thankfully, he didn't have to, because as it turned turned out, the guy wasn't random at all. He ran in the same social circle as Joe and was overheard talking about the whole thing by none other than Joe's ex-girlfriend, Paris Hilton. She turned the guy into the police, and Darnell Riley was promptly arrested and tried for burglary, robbery, carjacking, kidnapping, and attempted extortion. Darnell went to prison for 10 years, serving in Corcoran alongside Charles Manson, and then wrote a memoir about the whole thing. Now, I didn't read it, but according to page 6, super reliable source, Darnell says in there that the mob put him up to the job. It's an interesting detail. I mean, what if one of the mob members' daughters wound up on a tape? You never know. As this was all going down, Joe was also dealing with yet another lawsuit from a Girls Gone Wild participant, and I want to talk about this one specifically because this ruling set an interesting expectation and precedent for future cases. The story was pretty classic. A woman had flashed a cameraman at a frat party and wound up on the tapes and in the ads. She wanted to be removed. Joe was deposed and could not give a fuck less. At this point, he'd been sued multiple times and knew the drill. As he was questioned, he called the woman a slut and a whore. He proudly described the aggressive nature of his cameraman, and the way he saw it, this was just an idiot who had done something hot and gotten embarrassed by it. And the judge for the case agreed. He ruled that flashing in public removes any right to privacy that she was expecting, and because she wasn't a public figure, her likeness had no value for her to settle with. To me, this is one of Joe Francis's Nick Ritchie versus Sarah Jones cases. Go watch my video about the dirty if you're not familiar with that, but I feel like this case, among a couple others which we will definitely get to, demonstrated Joe's invincibility very well. In a court of law, regretting showing your boobs or doing sexual acts on camera was not enough to get that footage removed or get a cash settlement. To them, it wasn't Girls Gone Wild's fault that you changed your mind. It just was what it was. It really seemed like, barring being underaged and somehow getting around the release and ID check, you were shit out of luck if you had any sort of issue with Girls Gone Wild. That's not to say that there wasn't any opposition to the franchise, because there certainly was. It just wasn't always necessarily about protecting the women who appeared on the tapes. While Joe had pulled out the First Amendment to his advantage in Panama City Beach, it worked against him when it came to the federal government. George W. Bush's administration had set up a unit within the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute purveyors of obscene material. The Obscenity Prosecution Task Force moved with the belief that obscene material was not protected by the First Amendment and had no place in American society. And they went pretty hardcore, no pun intended, with the prosecutions. If you remember Two Girls, One Cup, they got the guy behind that, as well as several other porn distributors, and our man of the hour, Joe Francis. Now, if you look at official sources, the task force was developed at the urging of conservative Christian groups who didn't like porn. If you ask Joe Francis, he'll say that the White House Chief of Staff told him that they were only going after these guys to distract from what was happening in Iraq. My best personal guess is that it was probably a little bit of both. Regardless of their reasons, in 2006, the FBI raided the Girls Gone Wild office and confiscated hundreds of hours of footage. Because the company didn't keep sufficient records of all of the girls who appeared on tape, they were violating the law. You have to keep well-organized documentation of how old the performers are, their names, their locations, all of that stuff. And Girls Gone Wild just didn't have that information readily available. So that September, Joe pled guilty for the record-keeping problem and was sentenced to community service and a $2.1 million fine. Shortly thereafter, a cameraman was sent out to do Joe's community service for him as he dealt with even more scandals at home. Girls Gone Wild had caught the attention of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. Customers started complaining about being charged recurring fees when they intended to purchase a single DVD. So they'd order one Girls Gone Wild video and then continue to be charged as if they had purchased a monthly subscription. The only way to cancel this subscription that you didn't even sign up for was to get a new credit card entirely. As a result, the FTC ordered Girls Gone Wild to pay out $1.1 million in penalties and refunds. Around the same time, LA Times writer Claire Hoffman published an expose about Joe that made him look like a total fucking freak, honestly, a monster. In the article, Claire investigated several allegations against Joe from prior years. Back in 2000, in the early days of Girls Gone Wild, Joe's landlord had gotten a restraining order against him for threats and harassment. Apparently, he was pissed about garbage truck noise in the mornings and started pounding on her bedroom windows and dropping by her office to leave messages like, "Tell that bitch this is war." I get the frustration, but damn. 3 years later, a woman who rented out an event space for Joe to host this Halloween party at sued him for threatening to kill her after she refused to return his $25,000 deposit. The people he invited had totally trashed the venue, and he repeatedly threatened to fucking get her. After miscarrying her baby from the stress, she sued and settled. The year after that, there was this woman in South Beach who said that she was arguing with Joe in a bar about whether or not Girls Gone Wild was fucked up, and then she went back to his hotel room for a drink. Next thing she knew, she was waking up in bed with him the next morning. She pressed charges against him for allegedly her, but the case was dropped for insufficient evidence, and then Joe sued her for defamation. He told the press about how deeply offended he was to be called a racist. After all, he has 3 sisters. What kind of brother to 3 sisters would harm a woman? He also challenged her to a lie detector test after apparently taking 3 himself, and she refused. But kind of unsurprisingly, this South Beach woman wasn't the only one to accuse Joe of. In fact, when Claire was on the road with Joe and his crew, they brought a woman back to the bus who later shared a horrific story about the experience. This 18-year-old girl named Janelle said she was drunk in the club when Joe singled her out and invited her back to the bus. Now, she's never purchased Girls Gone Wild, so she's going off of the infomercials and thinking they're just gonna ask her to flash, she'll get a t-shirt, and that'll be that. But when she goes into the back room of the bus, she ends up using an object on herself and just faking a performance the best she can. Mid-filming, Joe comes back there and she tells him that she's a little uncomfortable because she's a virgin. He tells her, "Great, you won't be after my cameraman gets done with you." Gross. When she finishes filming the scene, the cameraman trades places with Joe, who then climbs on top of her. Despite her nose and verbal discomfort, he keeps going, and when he's done, he tells her not to tell anyone and ditches her in the back to clean herself up. She overhears him telling someone outside that she's not a virgin anymore. In exchange for the whole ordeal, Janelle takes home 3 pairs of booty shorts and spends the next few weeks telling her family about the incident and feeling super guilty and weird for putting herself in that position. She does go to the police and file a report, but nothing ever comes of it outside of this story being told publicly. One night on the road, Claire, Joe, and a few crew members are chatting with a police officer beside his cruiser. When the officer tells Claire to stop taking notes on their conversation, Joe reenacts his Panama City Beach arrest on Claire. He's pushing her body into the car and twisting her arms behind her back. At this point, she's scared that he's gonna break her arm, so she breaks free and punches him in the face before they're separated. Later, the police officer would tell Claire that he didn't intervene because he thought they were joking. But as soon as he saw how much pain she was in from the arm twisting, he called for backup. He told Claire that men like Joe have too much money and influence. They get away with shit like this so often that he'd love for her to press charges so they could throw him in jail, but she decided not to. The crew member who was with them didn't intervene either because he too thought it was all in good fun. After the dust settled that night, Joe found Claire awaiting her taxi and apologized. He told her that she was his favorite little reporter and asked her for a kiss. When Joe found out that this LA Times fluff piece had turned into an exposé, he called Claire's editor and accused her of being drunk that night, having a crush on him, and taking something that was meant to be a joke way too seriously. He also called Claire several times, threatening to sue her if she printed the story, calling her a bitch and saying that he was gonna get her. Where have we heard that before? Joe admitted through his lawyer that he and Janelle did have sex that night, but it was consensual. And if she said she was in pain, it was only because he was well endowed. Plus, Joe found it hard to believe that she was really a virgin after hearing that she was a local stripper. I'm sure he really clutched his pearls with that one. I just want to give props to Claire Hoffman because she was very brave for this one. Did celebrities cut ties with Joe Francis afterwards? Not to my knowledge. Did he stop getting away with heinous shit? Absolutely not. But it exposed a lot. Claire told stories that had been overlooked for years, and her article ended up being the 2nd most read piece in LA Times history. So let's stop at a little checkpoint for a second. We're in the mid-2000s now, and Joe has beat or settled dozens of lawsuits. He's been raided by the federal government. He's caught RICO charges in Florida. And he's running a multi-million-dollar empire during the day and partying with his celebrity best friends at night. Before Joe has to stand trial for shooting those underage girls in the shower, their families file a civil lawsuit against him. Now he's facing kind of a double whammy, if you will, and has to go back to Florida to mediate the case. When he goes into that little boardroom to hash out a settlement, they demand $70 million. Joe kicks off his flip-flops, puts his feet on the table, and tells them, "Suck my." Literally, he actually said that. He then leaves the mediation and immediately flies back to LA. Meanwhile, the lawyers repping the girls tell the judge about what happened, and he finds Joe in contempt. Now Joe has to return to the Florida Slammer. When it takes him a few days to get back, the judge issues another contempt order for that. So basically, this judge is done with his shit. He was truly a judge gone wild, as the press put it. And he was a former partner of one of the girls' lawyers, which made the crusade against Joe even stronger. So now Joe is back in jail again, and he's obviously not happy about it. He offers one of the guards there $100 to bring him a bottled water, and the guard is like, "Wait, how do you have $100? Turns out, Joe brought his wallet and various medications into the jail. They never searched him, and he claimed to not know that he wasn't allowed to have personal items. Boom. Contraband charge, and now that bail he got from the Panama City Beach case has officially been revoked. At this point, it kinda looks like Joe's fucked, and he's gonna have to sit in jail for what seems like a very long time. And while he's sitting there, he gets hit with additional charges in another state. When it rains, it pours. In April 2007, a federal jury in Reno indicts Joe for tax evasion. The allegation allegation is that Joe wrote off $20 million in bogus expenses back in 2002 and 2003. He also allegedly used offshore bank accounts and entities owned by other people to hide $15 million in earnings. Ah yes, another rich person playing the tax game, as Garrett White would say. But believe it or not, the tax evasion charges were actually kind of a blessing in disguise. Joe got to leave that horrible Florida jail and serve in Nevada. He'd been held in solitary confinement with 1 hour of yard time a day, and he'd heard from a guard that they'd been instructed to make his life hell. But in Nevada, everything is different. He's put into a special housing unit and has his own cell due to his celebrity. He spends his days on rolling conference calls, running his business, and ordering takeout. His correctional officers and fellow inmates are even friendly toward him because a lot of them love Girls Gone Wild. He even tells the story about a hairstylist who was serving for a DUI and gave him haircuts. And on the outside, the jailhouse press tour is working because people feel bad for Joe Francis. He starts his website, meetjoefrancis.com, which is this fluffy WordPress site delving into his personal history, legal troubles, and charity involvement. Quincy Jones makes a public statement in support of his neighbor Joe, noting that he's a giving person with a good heart. And his bestie, Kim Kardashian, is even papped wearing a free Joe Francis t-shirt. Kris Jenner gets a call from Joe on Keeping Up with the Kardashians and then laments about how they've got to get him out of there.
You're still in jail?
I'm still in jail. I can't believe it.
Oh my gosh, Joe, we need to come get you out.
Actually, wait a minute. Speaking of the Kardashians, let's talk about that connection really quickly because it's pretty interesting. Joe will tell you they would not be famous without him. Okay, so in the 2000s, Kim Kardashian was coming up with Paris Hilton, who at the time had her reality show The Simple Life. And The Simple Life had really been amplified by her sex tape with Rick Solomon. So Kim's dating Brandy's brother Ray J, and according to his manager, the couple started thinking about making a sex tape after seeing the success of Paris's. After all, reality TV was a huge hit at the time, and Kim wanted a show. This is where Joe Francis comes in. He was dating Kim's older sister Courtney and got introduced to the family. Due to his expertise, he brokered the deal to release the tape. Weeks after the tape gets out, the Kardashians sign a deal with E! To produce their show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And if you watch the show, you probably remember that Joe was a semi-regular staple. They do their very first photo shoot as sisters at his compound in Mexico. He attends their parties. I think it was the very first episode, Kendall and Kylie imitated Girls Gone Wild and were lifting their shirts before they got on the stripper pole.
Girls Gone Wild is like this.
Yeah, his impact. There was also that famous moment where Kim was hiding out in Mexico after the Paris robbery, and she calls Joe and she's like, "Can you hear me?" "Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?" "Is it safe here?" Like, Joe's Casa Aramara was her safe house. The Kardashians love Joe Francis. He even claims that they were featured on Girls Gone Wild back in the day. I don't remember this, but sometimes he tells the truth, so it's possible. Despite his ongoing legal and personal issues, they've stuck by his side. And something tells me it's because they are very grateful to him for helping start their careers. Either that, or he has some major shit on them, but I do think that they genuinely like him. Okay, so getting back to Joe and the legal issues. Right now, he has to worry about the Florida criminal charges and the Nevada tax evasion. But before Joe's Panama City Beach trial even begins, it becomes abundantly clear that these Florida officials completely fucked up the case. First of all, the RICO charges were going way too hard. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization penalties did not really match up to what Joe and Girls Gone Wild were doing. As the name suggests, these sort of charges were originally brought up to take down criminal organizations that were getting away with heinous shit, like the mob. RICO charges were filed against Osama bin Laden, mob boss John Gotti, and Young Thug, baby. It was just a bit much to put Joe Francis on the same level as people like that, you know what I mean? Unfortunately, this overshoot was amplified by the fact that authorities had gotten a bogus search warrant before raiding Joe's plane, car, condo, and hotel suites. The story is that in order to get the search warrant, they needed to show 2 instances of Girls Gone Wild featuring underage girls. All they really had was the scene of the girls in the shower, and yet the judge gave them the search warrant anyway. According to Joe, the investigators made up additional findings and accusations to get the judge to sign it. When Joe's legal team brought this up, every piece of evidence that they found with that illegitimate search warrant was thrown out. This included the drugs, the tapes, everything. A little bit of overexcitement about nailing Joe Francis led to the majority of the charges against him being dropped. Plus, state attorney Steve Meadows had been making the media rounds himself, participating in interviews about how awful Joe was. He'd even shown a Nightline reporter the shower scene footage, which, reminder, they were alleging that this was obviously not a good look. Joe pled no contest to the remaining child and prostitution charges, and he was a free man after almost a year in jail. As far as the contempt charges, he was sentenced to 339 days in prison with credit for time served, plus a $60,000 fine. He also agreed to stop filming in the area for the next 3 years. At his post-hearing press conference, Joe announced the launch of Girls Gone Wild magazine. Not much came from the tax evasion charges either. As it turns out, the prosecution's key witness was Michael Barrett, Girls Gone Wild's chief financial officer. And although his initial snitching seemed foolproof, he'd left out a couple of details. Mainly that he was the one who filed Joe's taxes, and he had participated in moving money to other accounts to hide their earnings. Oopsie. As a result, Joe got a plea deal that would keep him out of jail. He was ordered to pay $250,000 to the IRS as restitution. This was because he admitted to leaving out $500,000 in interest income from his tax returns. They also fined him for paying his Nevada jail guard to bring him that takeout that I mentioned earlier. After Joe gets out of jail, all of these legal problems are behind him, and now he's ready to pick up the pieces. This next couple of years, 2008 to 2010, is what Joe refers to as the peak of Girls Gone Wild. But he still did have those typical ongoing lawsuits. There was one that awarded a woman almost $6 million after her breasts were filmed without permission. There was also Ashley Dupree, a sex worker who got wrapped up in a scandal with New York's Governor Eliot Spitzer. Ashley sued Joe after he rescinded a $1 million collaboration offer. He was gonna do a whole magazine spread and tour with her, but then he found archived footage of her from 5 years earlier and took it all back. She claimed that she was 17 years old at the time of filming. In response, Joe released the footage of her ID check and waiver signing, and Ashley promptly dismissed the suit. But the ID in the video wasn't Ashley's, so the woman who it belonged to saw the footage and decided to sue Ashley and Girls Gone Wild. Crazy. Anyway, aside from that rigmarole, Joe's a pretty happy camper, I guess. At this point, he's reveling in the success of Guys Gone Wild, which is exactly what it sounds like. His producers would go out in the field, find hot straight guys, take them back to the buses, and goad them as they off. Joe has said many times that this franchise was an attempt to connect with the gay community, because what is a gay man's favorite thing? A straight man. And low-key, this line of thinking worked. Joe claims that one of its biggest fans is Elton John. I mean, it has 7.4 stars out of 10 on IMDb. Clearly some people liked it. In 2009, Mark Cuban and Joe develop a reality TV competition series for HDNet. The idea is that Joe Francis is traveling the country to search for the hottest girl in America, and much like any good competition show in the 2000s, fans get to vote on their favorite. The name of the show? The Search for the Hottest Girl in America. A bit on the nose. But the show did very well for HDNet and went on for 3 seasons. Joe wound up dating a winner, a model from Oklahoma named Abbey Wilson. He even bid on a political internship in DC for her. Yes, this is the most random story ever. Long story short, too late, the Wilshire Boulevard Temple was looking for donations. This guy from the temple, Chad, thought it would be a good idea to auction a 4-week internship with Senator Mark Pryor for a high schooler. Well, Joe bid on the internship and ended up winning, only for Senator Pryor to say, absolutely not, I am not letting the hottest girl in America be my unpaid summer intern. Turns out the temple never got permission from the senator to auction off the internship, and Abbey Wilson was not gonna jet off to DC as Joe had hoped. And as they both soaked in their reality TV success, Joe would have a run-in with another reality TV star that would leave his bank account and reputation in danger once again. In August 2009, Joe and Abbey are at the Guys and Dolls nightclub in LA when he is caught on security camera snatching a woman's hair and throwing her to the ground before punching and kicking her. What's weird about this is that this wasn't the first time that Joe had put hands on this specific woman. In fact, they'd met earlier that year at a party. Joe had gone to greet her boyfriend and elbowed her out of the way, leading to him being dragged out of there. And her boyfriend that Joe was so eager to say hello to? It was his good friend Brody Jenner, stepbrother to the Kardashian girls. Brody was dating Playboy model Jayde Nicole, who had actually appeared with him on The Hills. Shout out to The Hills. He was at Guys and Dolls with Jayde that night and confronted Joe after the beatdown. The two ended up in a physical fight and were both kicked out of the club. And then Brody and Jayde told their story to TMZ from the sidewalk.
He grabbed my hair and he punched me in the face.
Oh my God.
He threw me to the ground and he kicked me in my stomach, in my chest, and again, like right here. And then I just don't know what happened after that because I was on the ground. I just like.
Are you gonna go get checked in the hospital?
It really is for real. It's a traumatic time. My girlfriend, she's beat up. My girlfriend's beat up, dragged back my hair,
I mean, I can only...
According to Jayde, she threw a drink at Joe after catching him cheating on Abbey in the club, and he responded by attacking her. Brody also tweeted about the incident the following morning, saying that Joe Francis needed to be in jail. And I gotta tell you Joe's statement about everything too. He said, "I am the victim of a crime and I have bigger fish to fry. I'm dealing with some club rat in Hollywood and this is ridiculous because I'm a million times above this." He completely denied assaulting Jayde and let everyone know for good measure that Brody Jenner has a small Jayde ended up suing Joe for the assault and battery, and Joe countersued her and Brody. He said that he only attacked Jayde to defend himself because she was gonna throw a bottle at him. After Joe pulled Brody into the mix, Jayde settled pretty quickly. Brody also released a public apology to Joe. I'm assuming that this was a condition of their settlement. Interesting little note from his apology. He congratulated Joe on his marriage to a woman who was not Abbey. Joe had done a civil ceremony, not a legal marriage, with TV reporter Christina McLarty. It only lasted a month though, so not a huge part of the story. Anyway, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but there was hardly a 2-month period between 2000 and 2010 when Joe Francis was not facing some sort of legal or civil issue. The man is a drama magnet. If you can call scandals with underage girls, violence, consumer fraud, and sex tapes drama. 2010 marked a new decade that was sure to be filled with even more salacious Girls Gone Wild headlines. For starters, Joe was entering this new era with the Panama City Beach civil suit hanging over his head. Remember, he pled no contest to the child abuse and prostitution criminal charges, so he was off the hook for those, but the civil lawsuit still remained. The same judge who had sent Joe to jail for contempt a few years earlier presided over the civil case, and to this day, Joe maintains that the man had an axe to grind. According to Joe, his lawyer dropped out the first morning of trial due to a family emergency, and when he asked the judge for a continuance, he said no. So Joe's lawyer handed him a book about federal court procedure and told him to just represent himself. And he did. Joe cross-examined the women who were suing him himself. And I won't even lie, he cracked them. One plaintiff said that Joe had negatively impacted her schoolwork. She had loved geometry and she was really good at it. But after appearing on Girls Gone Wild, she had been ridiculed at school to the point where her grades slipped and she was forced to abandon her favorite subject. When Joe got up to cross-examine her, he stood and stared at the jury for a solid minute before asking her, "What's a right triangle?" And she couldn't fucking answer. Another plaintiff had previously said that her father had died of a heart attack upon finding out that she was on Girls Gone Wild. But upon cross-examination, she clarified that she had never claimed that Girls Gone Wild had killed her dad. Regardless of how bad it was going for the plaintiffs, the judge was not feeling Joe's antics. He didn't allow any of the footage of the girls to be shown to the jury, including a clip of them signing their waivers and another of a girl telling her friend, "We're gonna be stars." He wouldn't even allow Joe to ask them if they'd sign waivers or otherwise consented. He just didn't feel like it was fair to allow any evidence that showed consent because they were too young to legally give it anyway. Doing that might have confused the jury, which by the way was made up of 8 seemingly conservative women. He also cited Joe for contempt of court when he asked one of the plaintiffs if she'd ever been a prostitute. Joe claimed that he had proof of her being a sex worker on the tape that wasn't allowed to be shown, and the judge ordered Joe to pay a $2,500 fine and stop fucking talking. After all, 2 of the plaintiffs had already left the stand in tears after being questioned by him. He was harsh. At that point, Joe brought in 2 lawyers to finish out the trial for him. They contributed to the picture that these girls were sluts who had just lied about their age and actually loved being on Girls Gone Wild. But the odds were certainly stacked in the girls' favors. The reputation of Joe and Girls Gone Wild was slowly but surely heading downhill. Times were changing. Porn was becoming more cheaply available on the internet, and the whole young drunk girls flashing thing had started to be kind of questioned by society more and more. Plus, surely an all-women jury would not side with this awful man, right? Maybe they had daughters. Well, after 14 hours of deliberating, the jury returned to the courtroom and read their verdict. Joe Francis's behavior was beyond all possible bounds of decency and is regarded as shocking, atrocious, and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. But he did not have the intent to cause emotional distress to the plaintiffs, and therefore he was not liable. This lawsuit had the potential to completely cripple Girls Gone Wild. They were suing for over $100 million, but it didn't work, and Joe Francis kept carrying on. What the hell would it take to bring down Joe Francis for good? Well, weirdly enough, the takedown of Girls Gone Wild didn't have much to do with women, sex, or the videotapes. It actually had to do with gambling at one of Vegas's most famous hotels and casinos. Apparently, Joe had gotten himself into over $2 million of debt while gambling at the Wynn, and the hotel's namesake, Steve Wynn, was demanding demanding payment, with interest, but Joe refused to pay up. He claimed that Wynn was employing sex workers and other lures to keep him in the casino spending money. It wasn't his fault that he'd racked up the debt, it was the casino's. You may be noticing that a recurring theme in this video is that nothing is ever Joe Francis's fault and he never does anything wrong. He also said that his friend and neighbor Quincy Jones had shown him a bunch of emails from Steve that described a plan to get him whacked, essentially. Steve was gonna have him hit over the head and buried in the desert. Steve Wynn responded to these allegations with a defamation lawsuit. On the witness stand, Quincy Jones denied ever telling Joe that Steve was gonna kill him. It wasn't looking good. Steve wound up proving that Joe knowingly lied about the threats to discredit him and the casino. He was awarded $20 million, which he vowed to give away to charity. At the end of the day, obviously it wasn't about the money for Steve. It was about protecting his reputation and sticking it to Joe Francis. To protect Girls Gone Wild's money from the payout, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Girls Gone Wild was claiming that they only had $50,000 in assets, despite being on the hook for Steve's settlement and the woman who they owed $6 million to. But Mr. Wynn didn't give a damn. He said, y'all can file for bankruptcy if you want, but I'm not suing Girls Gone Wild, I'm suing Joe Francis, so this has nothing to do with any of that. After they filed for bankruptcy, Steve moved to appoint what's called a Chapter 11 trustee. Basically, he was saying that the company was doing shady shit and he wanted an outside person involved in the bankruptcy process. Steve Wynn claimed that Girls Gone Wild gave Joe an unlimited amount of money, and he'd been using company funds for a ton of personal bills, like his credit cards and attorney's fees. He also claimed that even though the company had removed Joe from any official position of power, he was still running shit. Even though Steve's settlement was ultimately reduced to less than $10 million, this situation was kind of like the prelude to the downfall of Girls Gone Wild. Joe Francis finally had his feet held up to the flames. In 2014, Girls Gone Wild was officially sold to an investor group called Liquidity Capital for $1.8 million. Joe fought the sale and tried to get a court to approve his block of it, but ultimately he was unsuccessful. He was also banned from ever going back to the Girls Gone Wild offices after threatening a bunch of employees, so there's that too. But the drama with Steve Wynn didn't stop Joe from his flashy party boy lifestyle. Throughout this whole shit show, Joe was still going out in LA, hitting the most exclusive nightclubs and bringing home the hottest girls he could. Sure, he was still on and off with Abby Wilson, the hottest girl in America, but boys will be boys. In 2011, Joe was out in Hollywood when he met 3 girls at a club. On his way out, he grabbed one of them to bring along in his car, and the other 2 followed, thinking that he was just gonna give them a ride back to their car that was parked down the street. Little did they know, Joe and his driver were actually taking them back to his house in Bel Air for an after party, and they refused to let the ladies get out of the car. Allegedly, the driver also flashed a police badge to scare them into submission. When they got back to Joe's, he tried to pull his girl of choice away from her friends, and when she rejected him, he grabbed her by her hair and slammed her head into the tile floor, allegedly. And if the whole grabbing a woman by her hair and slamming her to the ground part sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what he did to Jayde Nicole. Joe had the girls escorted out where they were warned not to contact the police because A, LAPD would definitely take Joe's side anyway, and B, if they did, they would be stranded in Bel Air because Joe's bodyguard wasn't gonna order them a taxi. Obviously, they acted like they were gonna comply, and then as soon as they got into the taxi, they called the police. Joe was charged with false imprisonment, dissuading a witness from reporting a crime, and assault. His bodyguard was also charged for his involvement. Joe bailed out of jail pretty much immediately and started denying everything. In a statement to TMZ, he said, "If you haven't noticed by now, I'm a huge target for false allegations and accusations like this. My bodyguard, who is a reserve sheriff, is always present at my house for any after party. The only thing I witnessed last week was a girl being struck by another girl who was then removed by my bodyguard." Okay, so it wasn't him who assaulted the girl. I guess it was one of her friends. God, I hate seeing girlfriends fight like this. Anyway, I won't keep you. Joe was convicted on every charge in 2013. Now, he had a potential 5-year sentence looming over him. And this was in addition to all of the bankruptcy drama. The day after his conviction, he did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, and the shit he said was crazy.
Wealthy people don't kidnap people and bring them to a party with, 30, 40 people. Just because a jury is mentally and jealous of who I am, that jury, you should be put in jail, you stupid idiots. That's all I have to say. You stupid, stupid idiots, you stupid jury, you should be put in jail or line up and
So he did end up apologizing for his remarks. I find it very interesting that he said he was sorry for the remarks that were attributed to him in the interview, instead of just saying he was sorry for saying them. But he said that anyone who was falsely convicted of a crime they didn't commit would be just as frustrated as he was. Sorry. Joe was sentenced to 270 days in jail, which he could bail out of during the appeal process, and that's exactly what he did. They also said he had to do psychological counseling for a year and an anger management course, plus probation. While Joe was bailed out and appealing, he and Abbey Wilson, the hottest girl in America, went down to Casa Aramara, Joe's enormous Mexico estate, and Joe has not been back to the US since. This man has now been a fugitive for a decade. He and Abbey had twin daughters via IVF. They did IVF because they specifically wanted girls without any sort of genetic diseases. After their pregnancy announcement, Joe hoped that people would finally understand his love, respect, and admiration for women. So Joe, Abbey, and their girls were living beautiful lives in Mexico, waited on 24/7 by a full staff of chefs, housekeepers, bartenders, and whoever else rich people hire to do shit for them. But in 2020, Joe finds himself in legal trouble once again when he's arrested and charged with domestic violence. Hi. Oh my gosh. Hi. Joe was accused of grabbing a woman at his house by her neck and spitting at her in hopes to pass along his COVID. He then screamed at and stepped on her. The story was that she worked for him at the house and refused to give him a vitamin injection because she was afraid of getting sick, and this enraged him. When the woman expressed her forgiveness for him, they let him go with the condition that he complete 6 months of therapy, which he did. But the therapy didn't fucking work because shortly thereafter, he and Abbey split. She alleged that he'd been addicted to drugs and abusive throughout their relationship, and she even went so far as to accuse him of hurting their twin girls. During an episode, the audio of which was recorded, Joe attacked Abbey and threatened to kill her. She also accused him of which he denies because he thinks you can't rape your partner. Seriously, that's his defense. After getting an order of protection against Joe, Abbey fled with their twin girls to the US, where she remains today. Joe hasn't seen or talked to his daughters since then. After Abbey's accusations got out, Joe shared on Instagram that she was lying, that she'd stolen $250,000 from him, and that she'd kidnapped their daughters. And I just gotta say, the way that Abbey has been smeared all across the internet is wild. When I was researching for this video, I found 9 websites dedicated to exposing her for taking his daughters and being a menace. On these websites, he has audio recordings of phone conversations with her, PDFs of custody agreements that she's allegedly violated, and blog posts recounting all of the fucked up things she's done. The website alleges that Abbey was the one who used drugs in front of the girls, abused them, and even lied about Joe abusing them. He also says that Abbey has various mental illnesses. It's a lot. And it's also set up as if it's not coming from him. Like it talks about Joe in the third person. I don't know. Today, Joe lives a relatively carefree life at his Mexican compound, still hosting celebrity pals and living a happy, semi-retired life. He's currently working on a documentary to respond to all of the hit pieces that have recently come out against him, and he maintains that all of his celebrity friends from back in the day still fuck with him on the low. You might not hear Kim Kardashian saying "Free Joe Francis" here in 2025, but rest assured, his girlies still have his back. Joe Francis brought about a cultural shift in the porn industry and in our society in general. Think about all of the references to Girls Gone Wild in pop culture. My point is that Girls Gone Wild was major. One of the biggest mainstream porn companies, on network television, plastered everywhere. It was nuts. Did we really think that the guy running that was gonna be squeaky clean? No. Joe Francis fit the part, for better or worse. As for his legacy, so far it's not great, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one. Thank you so much for watching this long-ass video. I appreciate you a lot. If you like videos about reality TV, pop culture, and internet history, I would love for you to subscribe. You can also follow me on TikTok and Instagram. I'm on both of those too. And I never really know how to end these. I will see you later. Bye!